New family, old shame, and a $500,000 surprise. That is the name the city would have given my winter if it spoke plainly. The season when my daughter introduced me to a room full of polished strangers as if I were part of the staff. The night a photographer waved me out of frame with the polite firmness reserved for people who carry trays. The week I learned that shame can be inherited like jewelry and worn for comfort. This is the story of a father who paid for a wedding he was not welcome to witness, a daughter divided between love and pride, and the quiet reckoning that arrived not with an argument but with an invoice laid on polished mahogany like a mirror none of us could refuse. I will begin where the trouble never admits it began, in the small, ordinary rooms where love commits itself to tedious things. Mine were the rooms of a working life. Mornings that smelled like coffee and pine cleaner, hands that learned early how to make do, a body that knew the ache of work the way a violin knows tension. I built decks and kitchens and small dreams into larger ones for other people, left fingerprints in grout that would outlast my name, and considered that a kind of immortality. When my daughter was small, she would sit on a drop cloth and announce colors the way a conductor announces crescendos. She once declared that eggshell was too shy, and that our living room needed the courage of buttercream. I let the walls believe her. We grew in the shade of missing things. Her mother loved us with a fierceness that couldn't be contained by the body that had to carry it. After the hospital taught us how to say goodbye politely, I learned to braid hair that escaped its own decisions, to pack lunches that tasted like a promise, to read bedtime stories until the words memorized the shape of her breathing. Work bent me. Love bent me back. We had a small apartment that wore second-hand furniture and first-hand laughter. I saved every receipt the way people save photographs. Paper that proved I was trying. The city changed while she learned cursive. Glass lifted itself into the sky and called it progress. I moved through neighborhoods that used to nod at me and now looked past me. But children believe their fathers can bargain with the weather. She believed I could make a storm wait until we got to the bus stop, and sometimes I did, the way men do small miracles that take more sweat than faith. When she was old enough to name the future without blushing, she called it medicine. She said the body was a kingdom and she wanted to learn its laws. I bought textbooks that smelled like paper about to become power. She studied at a kitchen table that still remembered the watermark of spilled milk. There are years that pass like traffic, ordered and forgettable, and then there are the years that arrive like a siren. And then there are the years that arrive like a siren. Her senior year sang loud. Letters from universities appeared like postcards from a place called Possibility. She chose a campus that spoke fluent ambition. The day I moved her into a dorm the size of our old living room, she hugged me quickly, the way people hug when they are already leaving, and I pretended not to notice that childhood had folded itself neatly and stepped onto a shelf behind her. This is the ordinary cruelty of success. It requires distance. I told myself that distance is not abandonment. I told myself many kind things that were mostly true. I kept working. I learned to accept that messages would come late or not at all. I learned that the silence of a grown child is often just noise you can't hear. When she called, I could hear the cadence of a new language in her voice. Not the vocabulary of medicine yet, but the dialect of rooms that had never learned to doubt themselves. She told me about classmates who wore last names like tailored suits, about study groups held in apartments where the art had alarms, about summers that came with stipends and addresses near opportunities that didn't require an introduction because introductions had been prepared before they were born. I met none of those people. I was the story she referenced with affection the way a teacher references a chapter you can skip and still pass the exam. When she came home for holidays, her suitcase looked more expensive than our first car. I did not resent it. I felt a quiet, almost foolish pride that I had raised someone who could enter rooms that would have required me to leave my own name at the coat check. The first time she brought him home, the city outside was practicing being kind. He arrived in a coat that understood winter without fearing it, shook my hand with the careful pressure of a person who had been taught that hands can break negotiations, and walked my apartment with the eyes of a man who knew where marble should go. He asked gentle questions. He complimented the woodwork in a tone that suggested he knew the difference between oak and apology. I made stew. He ate it like he was performing gratitude. My daughter watched both of us like a translator who knows two languages that refuse to like each other. I don't dislike wealthy men. Wealth is a kind of weather. You prepare for it. You respect it. You check it before you leave the house. What unsettled me was not his money, but the way it rearranged the furniture of the conversation. He told stories that had their own chauffeurs. The names of his friends arrived with addresses attached. When he said the word family, it sounded like a foundation rather than a porch. My daughter mirrored his sentences with new angles. I noticed how easily her voice fit inside his world, how my name looked smaller inside their plans, how laughter can carry a private map. They became engaged in a restaurant that photographs itself. The Ring offered its own weather report. Photographs slid across screens the way water finds inclination. Everyone followed. I learned about the venue next. The place had a name like a sailboat, a vineyard with hills that flexed like something that had been in charge for a long time. A ceremony among trees so curated they had publicists. She sent glossy pages with circles around possibilities. Dresses that understood lighting like theories. Flowers that required logistics. A weekend, not a day. I smiled into the phone and not a day. I smiled into the phone and told her what fathers have been telling daughters for centuries. That it would be perfect because she was in it. I said it because I believed it. I said it because I wanted to believe it. There is a moment when love becomes arithmetic. It happened when the numbers arrived. Budgets that were aspirational narratives more than they were financial plans. I studied estimates that used the word premium the way preachers use the word salvation. I know how much a wooden arch costs. I know how much a chair weighs. I know which materials can be coaxed into beauty without requiring a blood oath from the bank. I also know the look my daughter gives me when what she wants conflicts with what I can provide. I told her I would handle it. She told me that wasn't necessary. I told her that some things were not about necessary. They were about names on forms and the muscle memory of showing up. I began to move through my days like a man translating his labor into someone else's light. Contracts for tenting large enough to suggest weather was a toy. Kitchens that travel. Ovens that have opinions. Bartenders who arrive with an understanding of how joy should be measured. I met coordinators who called me by my first name with the practiced intimacy of people who never intend to call again. They asked about my preferred method of payment, as if we were discussing favorite seasons. I wrote checks that had been years in the making. I told myself this was what saving had been for, to finally spend it without flinching. I noticed, somewhere between the linen decisions and the tasting designed to convince us that food is a miracle, a soft new edge to my daughter's sentences. It was the edge of explanation dressed as protection. She began to tell me what not to wear, not unkindly, but with the efficiency of someone who has been assigned to quality control her own past. Plaids would make the photographer's teeth itch. Browns would flatten in the vineyard's green. Shoes should confess nothing about their history. The word humble did not appear, but its absence was loud. Not appear, but its absence was loud. She offered to take me shopping the way people offer to help you cross a street they do not trust you to cross safely. I accepted the suit she chose and practiced standing inside it like it had always been mine. I practiced my walk down an aisle I wasn't sure I would be invited to touch. I practiced smiling in a way that didn't apologize for where I came from. In the mirror, the man I have always been looked back with a patience I hoped would act like permission. The suit fit. The past less so. A rehearsal dinner appeared on the calendar with the casual arrogance of events hosted by people who assume calendars will accommodate. I arrived early because early is how you avoid making other people uncomfortable. The restaurant had a wall of wine that introduced itself. I found my name on a card that placed me near the edge of celebration. At the center, her new family gathered with the practiced choreography of people who have never been required to audition for belonging. They were pleasant. Pleasant is what power uses when it is conserving energy. Her future mother-in-law kissed the air near my cheek and told me I must be so proud in a tone that implied pride required membership dues. I nodded the way men nod when they realize they are guests inside their own history. Speeches were made. Laughter performed itself with genuine skill. My daughter stood near a window and wore a dress that edited light. She looked beautiful in the way courage looks when it learns to sit still. I watched the man beside her study her as if he had commissioned her. I realized then that love had made her fluent in another vocabulary, and that fluency had come, like all fluency, at the cost of an accent. My name sounded different in her mouth. Not wrong. Not untrue. Just less necessary to the sentence. I slept badly the night before the wedding, Not because of dread but because anticipation loosens the past from its moorings and lets it walk the house. I remembered her first bike with its stubborn training wheels. The scar above her eyebrow from the coffee table that refused to move, the science fair volcano that embarrassed itself into fame. I remembered the hospital's light and the first time she laughed like she had discovered she was capable of flight. I remembered a promise that no one heard me make, whispered into the soft unknown of a baby's ear, that I would do the boring work of love for as long as I could afford breath. Morning arrived dressed in the weather the planner ordered. The vineyard wore its richest green. The sky had been ironed. Vans like quiet decisions move people uphill. I wore the suit that had been chosen for me, and the face I had chosen for myself. Staff in black glided like punctuation through sentences that would be remembered only through photographs. The photographer found me early and asked if I could wait near the catering tents until called. I waited. Waiting is the full-time job of certain kinds of fathers. A coordinator approached at noon with a clipboard like a passport. She handed me a boutonniere the size of a confession and said someone would pin it when the bride was ready for the family photos. The phrase family photos settled into my pocket like a coin from a country that no longer exists. I walked toward the shaded grove where people with last names that looked good on invitations arranged themselves. I stood a polite distance from my daughter as hair and hope were corrected by a small army. She glanced at me the way people glance at a clock that has stopped but is still beautiful. The photographer asked for the bride with her parents. For a moment time forgot its instructions. Then the coordinator leaned in and, with efficiency that refused shame, substituted a phrase. The bride with her mother and guardians. The word landed like a rock wrapped in velvet. I stepped back because stepping back is a language older than money. I told myself that this was logistics. I told myself that the photo sequence would include me the way a credit sequence sometimes includes a name the producer almost forgot. My daughter did not meet my eyes. My daughter did not meet my eyes. I wanted to throw her a rope she could climb back down on. I wanted to throw her nothing at all and watch her learn the cost of altitude. Instead I stood and let the wind do what wind does. A waiter passed with champagne that told a story about restraint. He offered me a glass. I declined because I needed to remain balanced. The ceremony came and bent the room of us into its shape. Vows were read in voices that performed sincerity with accuracy. She said forever like a scientist naming a star. When the officiant offered the old line about who gives this woman away, the crowd laughed when no one stepped forward. The script had been modernized. I told myself that progress sometimes forgets how to bow to gratitude. After, the procession spilled like silk toward the reception lawn. A singer who had been trained to sound like Better Summers filled the air. Tables wore names instead of numbers. Ours was named for a city that had never been ours. I found my seat at the distant edge and studied place cards with fonts that knew their own value. Speeches rose and fell like tides with good posture. The toasts came from people whose stories about her began in rooms I had not been invited to enter. I prepared when my turn came to offer something small and true. A memory that could withstand comparison. The microphone did not travel to my name. No one noticed except the wind, which has been watching families longer than the rest of us. At sunset the photographer arranged the kind of light that forgives. Groups gathered and dissolved. When I stepped near a cluster where my daughter stood between her husband and the architecture of his lineage, the photographer smiled efficiently and asked if I could wait a moment while they finished with family. My daughter's eyes did a small frightened thing. She did not correct the sentence. She adjusted a strand of hair that did not need adjusting. I felt the earth make a mercy I did not deserve. It did not swallow me. You may wonder where the money is in all this. You may wonder where the money is in all this. It is in the tent that breathed like a sleeping animal. It is in the rented heaters that evenings are convinced to behave. It is in the floral arrangements that had their own postal codes. It is in my checking account and in the savings that were supposed to be a quieter ending. It is in a folder inside my truck, thick with contracts and receipts, the paper trail of a father turning decades of labor into one beautiful, indifferent day. When the band found the volume that makes dignity a rumor, I slipped away to the catering tents where the staff leaned against crates and traded the kind of jokes that turn exhaustion into a bridge. One of them nodded at me with the recognition of a fellow worker. At that moment, I understood my place for the evening with perfect clarity. Not a guest. Not family. Function. It would be easy to say that I decided then to punish her. That I crafted a plan to expose ingratitude in the currency the room respected. But the truth is simpler and, I think, harder. I did nothing. I did nothing in the way men do when they are deciding whether mercy should be part of the story. I stood between the smell of rosemary and rented propane and waited for my anger to grow teeth. It did not. It grew quiet. It took notes. By the time the cake performed its soft theatrics and the sparklers wrote cursive in the dark, I had made a small private vow. I would not argue for my place in a story I had funded. I would not demand the respect that should have arrived without an address label. I would finish what I had begun, which was to underwrite a day my daughter would one day be brave enough to remember honestly. Then I would send the room a mirror in the only language it seemed to understand. Not revenge. Accounting. The night ended with confetti that behaved itself. I carried boxes to the loading dock because carrying is a reflex I haven't unlearned. My daughter left through a tunnel of good intentions and flash. She did not see me. The vineyard swept itself into mourning while nobody was looking. Later, when the last van sighed and the staff stacked chairs into neat apologies, I sat alone at a table that had not been assigned to anyone and looked at the hill where vows had pretended to be immortal. I thought of my mother, who taught me that love is work you do in the rain without telling anyone. I thought of my father, who taught me to keep receipts not to prove others wrong but to remind myself that trying has a shape. I took the folder from my truck, opened it, and laid the papers out as if I were dealing cards to a future that had finally decided to sit down. The numbers sat there unafraid. The total rose like a tide that had been told it was safe to return. That is how quiet dignity makes its decisions. Not by shouting. By totaling. And this is where the world I built met the world she chose. Where both of us learned that shame is not a weapon, it is a mirror. I would deliver that mirror later, not to injure but to clarify. For now the vineyard breathed. The lights dimmed. The invoices cooled in the night air like stones taken from a river. I gathered them carefully, as if they were breakable truths, slid them back into their folder and stood. The story you came for, the $500,000 surprise, does not rush. It arrives with the steady gait of a man who has paid every bill on time, and finally remembers that payment can be a sentence that ends with a period, not a question mark. I walked to my truck, sat with my hands on the wheel, and let the engine hum a low note that matched the one in my chest. The night offered no advice. It rarely does. It only darkened properly, like something performing its role without vanity. I drove home through streets that had learned to glitter without my permission and parked in the spot that knows my tires by heart. Inside, the apartment greeted me with the quiet that has never mispronounced my name. I set the folder on the kitchen table that raised my daughter's dreams and my rent and turned off the overhead light. The lamp in the corner threw its old yellow on the stack of papers until they glowed like a congregation. The rest would come. Letters with letterheads. Numbers printed in fonts that had no patience for sentiment. Delivery not by anger but by certified mail, the way truth travels when it wants to be signed for. I rinsed a cup and left it upside down to dry, the way my mother did, as if even in endings there should be a small, ordinary order. Then I went to bed without rehearsing speeches I would never give. In the dark, I pictured her face the way it looked when she was 5 and had just discovered that a kite needs wind and patience, not strength. I wished her both. I wished myself the steadiness to send what needed sending without attaching the weight of blame to it. And in that wish, the next part of this story began to gather itself like weather far out at sea, inevitable, slow, and honest. Morning came dressed in silence. The kind that hangs over a room when there's something important waiting to be done. The coffee tasted the way old decisions do, strong, necessary, and slightly bitter. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder that had become heavier overnight. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was the shape of every hour I had ever traded for stability, every job that had blistered my hands, every yes I had said when I wanted to rest. Outside, the city was already busy pretending to forget. Cars sighed past, neighbors carried their small mournings like nothing in the world had changed. But I had reached the quiet understanding that only certain kinds of men ever reach, that you can't control how people treat your love, but you can control what it costs them to misunderstand it. So I opened the folder again. Invoice after invoice, crisp, numbered, undeniable. Tent installation. Generator rental. Florals by La Petite Fleur. Catering. base price and premium ambience upgrade, table rentals, linens, lighting, coordination fees, guest flow logistics, whatever that meant. Altogether, $500,000 in a language the world respected, math. And then I wrote a letter. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Davenport, I began, addressing it to her husband and his family, because that's how you speak to people who prefer their discomfort formal. Attached are the final invoices related to the wedding event of Mr. and Mrs. Davenport. The payments have been cleared in full by myself. The following itemized statement is provided for your records. You'll find the total sum enclosed below. Kindly make repayment directly to the originating account within 30 calendar days. I paused. My pen hovered over the paper like it wanted permission to do more than record a transaction. But I didn't add emotion or plea or explanation. Not because I didn't feel any, but because silence when written correctly sounds like dignity. I signed my name, not Dad, not Father, not love, always just Benjamin Kohl. The way a man signs when he has stopped asking to be believed. That afternoon I drove to the post office. The clerk recognized me, she always did. Morning, Ben, she said. That time of year for taxes again? Something like that, I replied. I slid the envelope across the counter. Certified mail. Return receipt requested. When she stamped it, I felt something quiet lift from my chest. It wasn't victory. It was relief disguised as stillness. 2 days passed before the phone rang. The voice on the other end was soft but sharp, the kind that has spent its life negotiating over brunch. Mr. Kohl, this is Victoria Davenport, she said. Trent's mother. I said nothing. Silence again proving its usefulness. I'm calling about this letter you sent. There must be some mistake. There isn't, I said. I'm sorry, but we assumed the expenses were part of your contribution. A gift, perhaps. It was a contribution, I said, to a day that cost more than it understood. But a gift requires gratitude, and gratitude was not present. She inhaled, the way people do when they're trying to find the polite version of condescension. Well, she said finally, surely you don't expect my son to reimburse you for his own wedding. Your son can pay for whatever he chooses, I said. This is not a reimbursement. It's a settlement. Settlement? She repeated. Of what? Of misunderstanding, I said, and hung up before she could respond. That night, I received a text from my daughter. The first in weeks. Dad, what did you do? No greeting. No apology. Just those 5 words that carried the weight of panic. I did what you taught me to do when someone forgets your worth, I replied. I reminded them. Minutes passed. Then another message. They're furious. Trent says this could ruin his reputation. They're saying you're extorting them. I laughed quietly. Extortion. The word people use when they realize kindness came with terms they ignored. Tell him it's not extortion. It's education, I wrote back. She didn't reply. Days became weeks. The mailman brought silence wrapped in envelopes. No payments, no apologies. But I wasn't waiting for either. I went to work as usual. Repaired a porch for an old couple who still said please. Fixed a sink that had learned how to complain in Morse code. Ate dinners alone but not lonely. Every once in a while I checked the account. Not for the money, but to confirm that I hadn't imagined the boundary I'd finally built. It was still there. A line drawn not in anger but in self-respect. Then one Sunday morning a knock came. I opened the door and there she was, my daughter, standing small against the daylight, her wedding ring catching sunlight like it didn't know better. Can I come in? She asked. I nodded. She stepped inside like she was visiting a memory she wasn't sure was heavier than before, but not impossible. Dad, she began, they think you're trying to humiliate us. I'm not, I said. Humiliation is loud. This is quiet. She frowned. I didn't think it mattered. The introductions, the photos. You didn't think I mattered, I said softly. That's different. She sat down. For a long time neither of us spoke. Then her voice cracked open. I was scared, she said. They look at me like I'm a project they funded. I wanted everything to be perfect. I didn't want them to see where I came from and think less of me. I nodded. You thought if you edited your story it would sound better. Tears blurred her eyes. You must hate me. No, I said. Hate's easy. I raised you to do harder things. She looked around the small apartment, the chipped mug, the uneven picture frame, the couch that had survived our entire history. I remember this place being bigger, she said. You were smaller, I replied. So was your shame. She winced, not from cruelty but from recognition. Before she left, she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. I can't pay it all right now, she said. But, here's something. I looked at it but didn't take it. You keep it, I said. It's not about the money anymore. Then what is it about? She asked, voice trembling. About you remembering that love isn't free because it's priceless. She nodded slowly, as if each word had to travel a long distance before it landed. Then she hugged me, carefully at first, then fully, the way she used to when she was still learning what home felt like. When she left, the door stayed open for a while, letting in light that had the color of forgiveness. Later that evening, I took the invoices from the table one last time. I added a single note on top before sealing them away in a drawer. Paid in full. Not by her. Not story hadn't been about revenge. It had been about remembering who I was and who I refused to stop being, even when the world asked me to stand outside the photograph. And somewhere in that remembering I found peace. There's a certain quiet after you've told the truth. It isn't peace, not yet. It's more like the silence that comes after a slammed door, when the air still hums with everything that was said and everything that wasn't. A week after my daughter's visit, I started noticing it, the echo of consequences. Small things first. A polite message from the wedding coordinator. Mr. Kohl, the Davenport family has requested copies of all payment authorizations you signed. Please confirm we may share them. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The thing about paper trails is that they already speak on your behalf. Then the phone calls began. Journalists. A luxury wedding blog. Even a morning show producer who left a voicemail that sounded like a confession. Mr. Kohl, we're covering a developing story about a viral invoice circulating online. $500,000 billed by a father to his daughter's wedding party. If you'd like to share your side. I stopped listening after that. Somebody, and I had a fair guess who, had leaked my letter. I didn't care much for publicity. I didn't even own social media accounts. But my coworkers did. They showed me headlines over lunch breaks, shaking their heads and smiling like I'd become a local legend. Father sends $500,000 invoice after daughter disowns him at wedding. 500,000 reasons to respect your parents. The classiest revenge ever? They called it poetic. They called it petty. They called it everything but what it really was, necessary. On the third morning my daughter called again. This time her voice wasn't shaking. It was angry. Dad, how could you let this happen? She said before I could even say hello. I didn't let anything happen, I said. I told the truth. The world decided it was entertainment. Well, it's ruining Trent's reputation, she snapped. People think we're greedy. They think you forgot where you came from, I said. Maybe it's good someone reminded them you didn't hatch out of marble. Silence. Then, do you have any idea how humiliating this is? Yes, I said quietly. I learned from the best. The line went dead. For a few days I tried to pretend the world wasn't watching. But the story grew legs, then wings. News anchors debated whether I was a hero or a villain. Comment sections split in two, half praising me, half damning me. My name trended beside words like class war, parental pride, and emotional debt. One night, while fixing a cabinet for a neighbor, the old man I was helping turned to me and said, "You the one from the news?" "Guess I am." He nodded. "Good on you. My son hasn't called in 6 years. Maybe I should send him an invoice too." We both laughed, but there was something heavy behind it, the kind of laugh that hides recognition. The Davenports were not laughing. A week later, I received a letter from their attorney. A crisp envelope, logo embossed in silver. Dear Mr. Kohl, our clients wish to address your recent publication of private financial correspondence, which has resulted in reputational harm. I didn't finish reading. I set it aside, poured myself a drink, and opened the window. The city lights blinked back at me like indifferent stars. Somewhere in a glass tower across town, my daughter was probably sitting at a table where my name was being spoken in the past tense. I could have fought it, called a lawyer, made statements, defended my dignity with words instead of silence. But I'd already learned that the world doesn't reward quiet men. misunderstands them. Still, there was power in restraint. Let them talk. Let the papers fill their columns. I had spent a lifetime being underestimated, surviving it. But even quiet men have limits. The first crack came when I stopped by the construction site one morning and found a stranger waiting by my truck. A reporter, young, sharp suit, sharper smile. "Mr. Kohl," he said. "Do you have a moment?" "No." He laughed. "You've become quite the symbol, sir. People are calling you the father of accountability." I sighed. "That's a long title for a short story. Would you mind sharing what motivated you? Was it revenge? Redemption? Some kind of social statement?" "None of those," I said. "Just arithmetic." He frowned. "Arithmetic?" "Yes," I said, starting my engine. "I paid a bill. They didn't. That's the whole equation." He stepped back, scribbling something in his notebook as I drove off. I knew the headline before he wrote it, "The Father Who Made Forgiveness a Transaction." That night I sat in the same kitchen, watching my reflection in the window. I thought about my daughter again, how she must be facing the storm of her own making. And despite everything, a small part of me still wanted to shield her from it. Love, it seems, is the only currency that refuses to devalue even after bankruptcy. I picked up my phone twice before setting it down again. Dignity and worry wrestled in my chest until the house went dark. A few nights later, another knock. This time it wasn't my daughter. It was her husband. He stood in the doorway like someone visiting a ghost he didn't believe in. "Mr. Kohl," he said, his voice rehearsed. "Can I come in?" I nodded. "If you're here to threaten me, let's do it somewhere comfortable." He didn't laugh. He stepped inside, looked around at the small apartment like it was a museum exhibit. His cologne reached the walls before his words did. "I'll get straight to it," he said. "The media attention has been problematic. Investors are pulling away from one of mine's been dragged into something that should have stayed private." "Then maybe you should have kept it private," I said. He exhaled slowly. "Look, I don't want this to get uglier. We're willing to settle this quietly. I can transfer the payment today, under the condition that you release a statement clarifying this was all a misunderstanding." I leaned back. "You mean a lie?" He hesitated. "A correction." I smiled. "There's a difference between a correction and a cover-up. You should know that. You deal in image for a living." His jaw tightened. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "No," I said. "You're mistaking satisfaction for peace." He placed a small envelope on the table. $500,000. Plus $25,000 for your trouble. No one needs to know. I looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "Tell me something," I said. "When you proposed to my daughter, did you offer her love? Or did you offer her an investment?" He frowned. "That's not fair." "No," I said, "but it's accurate." He stood there waiting for me to change my mind. I didn't. Finally, he picked up the envelope, adjusted his tie and said, "You'll regret this." "Maybe," I said, "but not tonight." When he left, the air smelled faintly of expensive failure. That was the night I realized this wasn't just about a wedding. It was about the world my daughter had married into, one where affection is public, loyalty is conditional, and apologies are written on letterheads. It wasn't my world and I wasn't jealous of it. I just pitied it. Still, storms don't pass quietly. The morning after Trent's visit, I found the envelope he'd left on the porch. He must have returned after I went to bed. Or maybe he couldn't stand leaving the last word behind. It wasn't sealed, just resting there, open, a whisper of money visible inside. I didn't count it. I didn't even touch it. I carried it back inside, placed it in a drawer, and thought about how often money tries to disguise itself as apology. By the time the sun cleared the rooftops, my name had already traveled farther than I ever had. A friend from work sent a photo of a morning headline. "The $500,000 father who refused to be invisible." I read it while stirring my coffee, the spoon clinking against the mug like a clock running out of patience. The article wasn't cruel, not exactly. It told my story in fragments, some true, some borrowed, all tidy. It described me as a carpenter, humble but proud, as though humility needed a footnote. It said my daughter rejected his presence at her high society wedding, and that I had responded with financial precision. I recognized the phrases of a world that likes its outrage polite. But then halfway down, I found a quote from a close family source. He was always difficult, it read. Never happy for her. He wanted control even over her happiness. This invoice stunt just proves it. The words stung less than the realization that they were probably hers. For the next few days, the phone became an enemy. It rang with strangers, talk show hosts, podcasters, even an author who said he wanted to write a book about me. I let it all go to voicemail. Fame, I learned, is just another form of noise. Then one evening, a different kind of call came. Mr. Kohl. The voice was warm, steady. This is Detective Monroe with the local precinct. We've received a complaint from the Davenport family regarding possible harassment and defamation. It's probably procedural, but I'd like to meet and clear things up. I almost laughed. Defamation. An elegant word for guilt refusing to change its clothes. Sure, I said. I'll come by tomorrow. The next morning, the detective met me in a small office that smelled of old coffee and paper. He looked tired in the way honest men often do. Let's get this out of the way, he said. Nobody's charging you with anything. But the Davenports are persistent. I imagine they are, I said. He leaned back studying me. They've got influence. But I read the file. Seems to me you're just a man who sent a bill. That's all I ever was, I said. He nodded. Then I'll file it as closed. But if I were you, I'd lay low for a while. I've been laying low my whole life, I said. Maybe it's their turn. That night, I turned off the TV halfway through a segment discussing the ethics of parental debt. The host smiled too easily, her makeup shining under studio lights. A panelist, a family psychologist, called my actions performative punishment. Another called it a cry for validation. Validation. The word lingered like a mosquito. People mistake dignity for need. They think quiet men act from emptiness. But my act hadn't come from wanting anything. It had come from remembering I already had everything that mattered once. I sat back staring at the wall and thought about my daughter. What must her days look like now? The Davenport's perfect dinners interrupted by reporters, her husband pacing, her new in-laws whispering about damage control. I could picture her smile cracking under the pressure of pretending nothing was wrong. Part of me wanted to drive there, to knock on that mansion door, take her hand and remind her that the truth, no matter how loud the world shouts around it, doesn't need defending. It just needs time. Instead, I wrote her a letter. Not an invoice, not a statement, just a letter. You once told me when you were little that you wanted to make people better. I think you still can. But first you have to stop pretending you were never sick too. I didn't raise you to be ashamed of the dirt under your story. I raised you to plant things in it. I didn't sign it, Dad. I didn't have to. Weeks passed. The story began to fade from the front page. The headlines moved on to newer scandals, younger mistakes. But echoes lingered in grocery lines, still nodded at me on the street like I'd survived something extraordinary. I hadn't. I just survived pride, mine and hers. Then one afternoon, I found a letter in my mailbox. No return address. The handwriting was familiar. I'm sorry. Not for the money. For the silence. I thought if I made my world louder, it would drown out the parts of me that still sounded like you. I was wrong. They told me to choose between love and belonging, and I didn't realize they were the same thing until I lost both. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm trying. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a name. Some things only a daughter could write. I folded the letter carefully and set it beside the old invoices. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like keeping records. Some debts, after all, are meant to remain uncollected. Still, truth has a way of asking for witnesses. 2 days later, a journalist knocked again. Not the slick one from before, but an older woman with a notebook and a patience I recognized. I'm not here for a quote, she said. I just wanted to meet you. My father was a carpenter. He died before I could tell him I understood him better now than I ever did when he was alive. I didn't know what to say. She smiled gently. You gave a lot of men like him a kind of voice. Thank you. When she left, the apartment felt a little larger. That night I went for a walk. The city was quieter than usual, rain softening its edges, washing down its pride. I stopped outside a bakery that was closing up for the night, and saw a young man helping his daughter into a raincoat. She giggled, reaching for his hand. Something about the sight caught in my throat. I thought about how easily love becomes invisible when people stop saying its name aloud. How often we bury it under ambition and call the burial a future. And standing there in the drizzle, I made a quiet promise, to her, to myself, to all the fathers who've ever been turned into footnotes, that this story, for all its noise, would not end in anger. It would end in understanding. When you've lived long enough, you start to recognize the sound of things breaking. It isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the soft click of a lock turning the wrong way. Sometimes it's a voice trembling halfway through a lie. For me, it was the hollow ring of my phone one quiet Sunday morning, the kind of hour reserved for churches and regrets. "Dad." Her voice was thin, barely there, the sound of someone whose confidence had gone missing. "Can you come?" she asked. "Please." I didn't ask where. I already knew. The Davenport estate sat on a hill that had forgotten the meaning of struggle. The driveway curved like a signature too confident to end. Cars that cost more than my old neighborhood lined the path, but the windows inside were dark. The kind of dark that hides panic behind curtains. When she opened the door, she looked smaller again, like the version of her I remembered holding after scraped knees and failed exams. Only now, her wounds weren't visible. They were stitched beneath designer fabric and sleepless eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You didn't give me much of a choice," I replied. She led me through a house that smelled of flowers trying too hard. At the kitchen island, Trent stood with a glass of something expensive, the liquid trembling against the rim. He looked up, saw me, and exhaled like a man bracing for surgery. "We're in trouble," my daughter said quietly. I waited. Trouble is a word that always arrives late to the truth. "The investors," she continued. "They're pulling out. They say the bad press has made them nervous. Trent's accounts are frozen pending review. And the house," she swallowed. "The house might go next." Trent cut in, sharp and tired. "We need help, Mr. Kohl." I wouldn't ask, but I almost laughed. Not cruelly, but with the kind of disbelief that comes from seeing irony show up right on time. "You want me to fix what your arrogance broke," I said. He flinched. "It's not about arrogance. It's always about arrogance," I interrupted. "The kind that thinks decency is optional." My daughter touched my arm. "Dad, please. I know what this looks like, but we didn't." "I know what it looks like," I said. "It looks like a reckoning." We sat at the long table that could have fed 12 but now hosted 3 people trying not to choke on pride. Papers were spread out. Statements, foreclosure notices, emails full of polite threats. "I don't have that kind of money," Trent said, rubbing his forehead. "But you understand finance. You could." "Stop," I said. "I'm not your bailout plan." My daughter's eyes shimmered. "We're not asking for that. Just advice. What do we do?" For a moment the room softened. I looked at her, really looked. Beneath the exhaustion and makeup and worry, she was still the little girl who once believed I could fix anything with a steady hand and a quiet mind. "First," I said, "you stop lying to yourselves. You stop pretending that your world collapsed because of me or the media or bad luck. It collapsed because you built it on pride instead of honesty. And pride doesn't survive rain." She nodded slowly. "I know." Trent stood, pacing. "You think I don't know what people are saying about me? Every article, every headline. I'm the villain in your redemption story. The man who stole your daughter, erased your name, and got billed for the privilege." I met his glare evenly. "If the shoe fits," he slammed his glass down. "You think you're righteous? You humiliated us." "I didn't humiliate you," I said. "You did that yourselves. I just sent the receipt." For a moment I thought he'd shout. Instead he deflated, his shoulders slumped, his voice quieted. "I don't know what to do anymore." "Then start by telling the truth," I said. "Public living. You can't build a life on image and expect it to hold." He looked away. "That's easy for you to say." "No," I said softly. "It's taken me a lifetime to say it." That night I stayed at the house. Not because they asked, but because walking away felt unfinished. I slept in a guest room that smelled like furniture polish and secrets. The sheets were too crisp, untouched, unearned. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering when comfort had become such a fragile thing. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear them arguing, low, strained voices that sounded more like apologies than accusations. I closed my eyes and prayed, Not for their fortune but for their honesty. The next morning my daughter found me on the patio. She carried 2 mugs of coffee, one chipped, one perfect. She handed me the chipped one, maybe by accident, maybe not. I told Trent I want to sell the house, she said. Pay off the debts. Start over. I nodded. That's a start. She hesitated. I also told him I want to see you more. Really see you. I looked at her for a long time, searching for sincerity. I found it quiet, raw, trembling like something new. Then you start by coming home, I said. Not the house you grew up in. The home that waits when you stop running from yourself. Later that day I drove back down the hill. In my rearview mirror, the mansion shrank until it was just another outline against the sky, beautiful, distant, and no longer mine to worry about. At a stoplight my phone buzzed. A message from my daughter. Thank you. For showing up when I deserved it least. I didn't reply. Some words don't need company. For the first time in a long while I felt a strange peace settle in my chest, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just lingers quietly and lets you breathe. I knew this wasn't the end. Her marriage still had to survive its own shadows. My pride still had to learn this again. But for the first time the distance between us didn't feel like exile. It felt like healing in progress. And maybe that was enough for now. In the days that followed I didn't expect miracles. The kind of damage pride doesn't heal overnight. It takes its time, peeling back layers until what's left is small, honest, and often a little raw. But I could feel the shift, quiet and certain, like the air before rain. 3 mornings after I left the Davenport house, my daughter called again. Her voice carried something I hadn't heard in years, clarity. Dad, she said, I've made a decision. I didn't interrupt. Decisions sound different when they're real, they carry weight in their breath. I'm selling the house, she continued. Trent doesn't agree, but it's the only way to settle everything cleanly. And I've written a statement. That last part made me sit up. A statement. Yes, I'm going to make it public. About the wedding, the money, all of it. I need people to hear my side, our side, but this time the truth. I said nothing for a moment. My heart ached, but not from pain. From pride, the quiet kind that doesn't need applause. Send it to me before you post it, I said. Not to edit. Just to read. She hesitated. You trust me with this? I never stopped, I said. That night her email arrived. I opened it slowly, half afraid of what the words might do to me. To those who followed our story, my father's invoice was never about revenge. It was about value. The kind that can't be measured in money but must be honored with it. I was ashamed of my roots, afraid they'd look too humble against the backdrop of my new life. I asked my father to stand aside, and he did, because that's what love does, even when it's being erased. I thought that made me powerful. It made me poor. I can't undo the silence I gave him, or the shame I carried like a trophy. But I can say this. He never humiliated me. From becoming someone I wouldn't recognize. The world saw a bill. What I saw too late was a mirror. I read it twice, then a third time, and then I cried, quietly, like men do when they realize the storm has finally passed. The next morning the statement was everywhere. News outlets shared it with headlines that finally got it right. Daughter breaks silence. A father's lesson in love. The noise that had once condemned me began to soften. Comments changed from outrage to reflection. Even people I didn't know wrote messages that said things like, I called my dad today. It didn't fix the past, but it did something rarer, it redeemed it. 2 weeks later, my daughter showed up at my workshop. No cameras, no reporters, no rehearsed lines. Just her. She wore jeans and an old college sweatshirt. Her nails weren't polished. Her eyes were tired but alive. She stood there looking around the place that had built her childhood. The smell of sawdust, the hum of memory still hanging in the air. I missed this, she said softly. I missed you, I said. She nodded, and that was all it took. The apology was already there between us. Words would have ruined it. She helped me sand a table that day. Her hands, once delicate and manicured, learned again the language of labor. And for the first time in years I saw her smile without pretending. When she left, she kissed my cheek and said, I'll see you soon. Not I'll call you. Not let's stay in touch. Just see you soon. And somehow that was enough to fix a decade's worth of silence. Later that night, I got a call from Trent. He didn't sound angry, just tired. I'm leaving the business, he said. Selling what's left. Moving out of the house. Good, I said. Your daughter's stronger than I thought, he added. Stronger than me. She comes from good stock, I said. He laughed once, dry, almost humble. You win. It wasn't a contest, I said. For you, maybe, he replied and hung up. That weekend, the paper ran a final story. Not about money or scandal, but about something smaller and somehow greater. A simple photo of my daughter standing beside me in the workshop, hands dusty, faces honest. The caption read, "New family, old shame, and a lesson worth $500,000. Didn't make me famous. It made me seen. And that was all I ever wanted." Still, the quiet came back, as it always does. Life has a way of closing its circles neatly when you let it. The phone stopped ringing. The mail went back to being bills and catalogs. The city's gossip found new names to chew on. But every few days she'd stop by. Sometimes with coffee, sometimes with nothing but a smile. We didn't talk about the wedding anymore. We didn't need to. Some debts can't be settled with numbers. They're paid in forgiveness, interest-free. And as I sat at my table one evening, watching the sun crawl down the skyline, I thought about the strange arithmetic of love. How it multiplies when divided. How it adds meaning even when it subtracts pride. How sometimes the only balance sheet that matters is the one written in peace. Peace doesn't arrive with applause. It shows up quietly, like a guest who knows where the cups are kept. And yet, as I look back now, I realize peace was never something that came to me. I had to learn to meet it halfway. After the statement, after the apologies, after the cameras found new storms to chase, life returned to its slower rhythm. Mornings smelled of coffee again. The radio talked about the weather instead of my name. The only invoices I handled were the kind that still made sense: lumber, nails, paint. But inside, something had changed. Forgiveness isn't a single act. It's a habit. And I was still learning the steps. The workshop became my chapel. Every plank of wood had a pulse. Every nail a story. When you work with your hands, you start to see how fragile beauty really is. How easily it splinters, how gracefully it can be mended if you're patient. Some afternoons my daughter would stop by. No grand gestures, no explanations. Just her presence, the way it used to be before ambition became her language. She'd sit on the stool by the window watching me plane a board smooth, the smell of cedar curling through the air. "Do you ever think about the wedding?" she asked once quietly. "Sometimes," I said. And I remember the parts that were worth keeping," I replied. She smiled. "Like what?" "The way the light hit the vineyard when you said your vows. The sound of the wind. You standing there, even if you forgot to look for me." Her eyes shimmered. "I didn't forget. I just couldn't look without breaking." I nodded. That's what growing up feels like sometimes. Breaking in the right direction. The more we talked, the more I understood something I'd missed for years. That love doesn't vanish when pride enters the room. It just waits in the corner until someone's brave enough to invite it back to the table. She began helping around the workshop. Small tasks at first: sweeping sawdust, sorting tools. But each motion felt like therapy disguised as routine. One afternoon, she found an old photo pinned to the corkboard. Her at 7 years old, missing a front tooth, standing beside a crooked bookshelf we'd built together. She smiled. "You still have this?" "Of course," I said. "It's proof that perfection isn't the point." She looked at the photo for a long time before whispering, "I wish I'd remembered that sooner." Trent, on the other hand, disappeared quietly from her life. No public announcement, no messy divorce headlines. Just absence, the cleanest ending pride can offer. When I asked her how she felt about it, she said, "Relieved. He loved who I was trying to be. You loved who I already was." There it was, the truth distilled into a sentence simple enough to carry the weight of everything that came before. But healing isn't a straight road. It bends back sometimes just to test your footing. A month later, she came by late, her face pale, eyes swollen. "Dad," she said, standing in the doorway, "I think I made another mistake." She held up her phone. A message thread. It was from a journalist, one who'd covered our story from the start. They were offering her money for an exclusive interview. A "Where Are They Now" feature. "I told them no," she said. "But part of me wanted to say yes. Not for the money, for the closure." I nodded. Closure doesn't come from explaining the past. It comes from living in the present long enough that the past gets bored and leaves you alone. She laughed through her tears. You always know what to say. No, I said. I just learned when not to. She stayed the night. Fell asleep on the old couch that once doubled as her childhood fort. When I woke in the middle of the night, the moonlight was stretched across her face. Peace looked good on her. The kind that comes after exhaustion, not escape. I sat there for a while just watching her breathe. And for the first time in years I didn't feel like a father who'd lost a daughter. I felt like a man who had found one again. In the morning she made breakfast badly. Burned toast, oversalted eggs, orange juice that still had pulp. But it was the best meal I'd had in months. While she washed the dishes I noticed something tucked beneath the sugar jar. A check. Picked it up. Half the total from the original invoice. Where did you get this? I asked. I've been freelancing, she said. Medical writing, consulting. It's not much, but... I cut her off gently. You don't owe me anything. She smiled. I know. That's why it's a gift. I looked at the check for a long moment before sliding it back. Then keep it, I said. Use it for something that grows around. Like what? Yourself, I said. You're overdue. That night after she left I stood by the window, the city humming softly beneath me. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't the absence of resentment. It's the decision to stop rehearsing it. And I'd finally stopped rehearsing. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't an act of mercy. It's an admission that we're all a little guilty of the same thing, expecting love to arrive without cost. A few days after that morning, life settled again into its quiet rhythm. The phone stopped feeling like a threat. The air between us softened. But peace has a strange way of revealing what it hides. And I was beginning to see the parts of myself I hadn't forgiven yet. It started small. An old voicemail from her, months before the wedding, surfaced when I was clearing my inbox. Her voice was bright, careless, full of the kind of confidence that makes fathers proud and uneasy at the same time. Dad, I met someone. He's incredible. I can't wait for you to meet him. You'll love him, I promise. I sat there listening to it again and again, realizing how easily promises turn into ghosts. And yet there was no bitterness left, just an ache that felt clean. Regret, not resentment. That night, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the kind that smells faintly of dust and renewal. Houses glowed from within, families laughing, lights flickering, normal life moving forward. I wondered how many fathers were sitting behind those windows, wondering if they too had given too much or not enough. Somewhere between the second and third block I stopped punishing myself for both. A week later my daughter called. Can you come by the clinic tomorrow? She asked. There's something I want to show you. The next morning I found her waiting outside a modest brick building downtown, the kind of place that didn't advertise itself, just quietly served whoever needed it. Welcome to the Davenport Family Health Center, she said, smiling. My heart stuttered. You opened this? With the money I was going to give you, she said. And a few grants. It's not much, but it's a start. Free care for low-income families. Kids, single parents, seniors. People who get left behind. I looked at her, then at the building. Inside, nurses moved like purpose had replaced oxygen. A small boy waved at me from the waiting area. His mother smiled shyly. I swallowed hard. Why tell me now? Because I needed to do something right before I could forgive myself, she said. I nodded. And you did. She led me into her small office. Plain walls, one desk, two chairs, and a photo of us from the workshop pinned to the corkboard. I keep it there to remind me where I started, she said. Seems you're exactly where you belong, I replied. We sat in silence for a moment. There was something sacred about that quiet, the kind that doesn't need words because it's already full of them. Then she reached into her drawer and handed me a small box. Go on, she said. Inside was a wooden plaque, hand-carved, the kind you can't order online. In honor of Benjamin Kohl, the foundation beneath it all. I ran my fingers across the letters, feeling the groove. She must have sanded herself. You made this? I asked. With the same tools you taught me to use, she said softly. I felt something break inside me, not the old way, not like loss or anger. It broke open like light through a door that had been closed too long. You didn't have to. I did, she said. Because I need you to know. I don't just forgive you. I admire you. The words hit harder than any apology ever could. Admiration. The one thing children stop offering their parents when they start mistaking perfection for love. That evening I stayed after closing. The clinic lights dimmed one by one until only the reception desk glowed. My daughter was locking up, humming softly. The halls, fresh paint, new purpose, quiet hope. On one wall hung a photo of the vineyard. The same one where I had stood on the margins, invisible. But in this photo I wasn't cropped out. Someone, had drawn a faint outline of me into the corner, just beneath the trees. Not for pity, for truth. When I asked her about it, she said, I didn't want to erase the moment. I just wanted to fix what the camera missed. Driving home that night, I thought about how strange redemption is. Doesn't feel like victory. It feels like surrender, a soft exhale after years of holding your breath. The streetlights blurred against my windshield. I caught my reflection in the glass, older, calmer, finally at peace with the man who'd done his best and the father who'd failed sometimes doing it. At a red light, I whispered to no one, You did good, Ben. And for once I believed it. Back home, I took the plaque she gave me and hung it above my workbench. Beneath it, I pinned the last invoice, the one I'd marked paid in full. It didn't look like a wound anymore. It looked like proof that sometimes the hardest lessons aren't about money or pride or forgiveness. They're about endurance. Because in the end, love doesn't vanish when you're pushed aside. It waits for you to come back strong enough to hold it without shaking. And that night, as the clock hummed softly in the corner, I realized the truth of it all. You can't buy redemption. You can only build it, one scar, one breath, one act of quiet grace at a time. Peace has a way of testing itself. It never asks politely, it knocks once, then pushes the door open to see if you've really changed. It came for me on an ordinary Tuesday. The kind of morning where the light feels forgiving, and the radio hums without choosing sides. I was sanding down an old dresser in the workshop when the phone rang. My daughter's voice came through, breathless, urgent. Dad, I need you at the clinic. Now. I dropped everything. When I arrived, the waiting room was full, mothers clutching children, nurses whispering, a paramedic in uniform standing by the desk. My daughter stood near the door, pale, trembling. What happened? I asked. She pointed to a woman slumped in a chair near the wall. Mid-50s maybe, face drawn tight by years of something harder than age. She came in for chest pain, my daughter said. No ID. No insurance. Said she used to work for the Davenports in their house. She collapsed before we could even get her name. I looked closer. And then the world tilted. Linda. I whispered. It was her, the housekeeper. The one who'd been kind to me at the wedding when no one else had. The one who had handed me a bottle of water behind the catering tent and said, You must be proud, sir. She looks beautiful. Now she was unconscious, her breath shallow, her hands gripping the armrest like she was holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. Hours blurred into motion. Paramedics moved her to the nearest hospital. My daughter stayed by her side the whole time. I followed silent, feeling the weight of 1,000 small moments catching up to me. At the hospital, a doctor explained that she'd suffered a mild heart attack. She would live, but she'd need rest, medication, and follow-up care she couldn't afford. She doesn't have anyone listed, the nurse said. No family, no emergency contacts. My daughter looked at me. I knew that look. It was the same one she had when she was little, when she found a bird with a broken wing in the backyard and begged me to fix it. Dad, she said softly, can we help her? I didn't hesitate. Of course. That night, after Linda was stable, my daughter sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand. She told me something before she fell asleep, she said quietly. She said she was fired after the wedding. The Davenports said she leaked the story. I closed my eyes. The puzzle pieces fit together in a way. They blamed her to protect themselves, I said. And she paid the price. My daughter's jaw tightened. We're not letting that stand. There it was, the voice she'd inherited from me. Calm, steady, dangerous only to injustice. Over the next week, she handled everything. She filed for Linda's care under the clinic's outreach fund. She called the labor board, gathered evidence, even reached out to a journalist who still owed her a favor. And I watched her work. Not as a doctor, not as a daughter, but as something greater, proof that grace can evolve into strength without losing its tenderness. One evening as we left the hospital, she turned to me and said, "I used to think you sent that invoice out of anger. But now I see it wasn't about the money. It was about making sure the world couldn't ignore what it owed." I smiled. Sometimes silence needs an invoice. A week later the story broke again. Davenport family accused of wrongful termination. Former employee fired after wedding scandal speaks out. The headline spread fast, but this time the noise wasn't cruel, it was clarifying. Linda recovered slowly. She came to the clinic once a week, always with flowers, always insisting on paying something, even if it was just gratitude. The first time she saw me again, she said, "You were right, Mr. Kohl. Dignity travels slower than gossip, but it always gets where it's going." That night, after locking up, my daughter and I stood in front of the clinic. The sign above the door glowed faintly under the streetlights. "You know," she said, "you taught me that truth doesn't need to shout." I chuckled. "You sure learned that the loud way." She smiled. "Maybe. But it stuck." We stood there for a while, neither of us speaking, just watching the lights of the city stretch into the distance. I thought about all the places we'd been, the vineyard, the silence, the storm, and how somehow it all led here to this calm, honest glow. But this, like any good teacher, wasn't done with me yet. 2 days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The return address, Trent Davenport, Los Angeles. I turned it over in my hands for a while before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Mr. Kohl, I wanted you to know I read her statement. And I saw what she's built. You were right about me. I was more interested in winning than in loving. I'm trying to change that. There's a foundation forming in her name. I've made a donation to it. Maybe that's how I start making things right. Thank you for not destroying me when you could have. Trent." I folded the letter, slid it into the drawer beside the plaque she gave me and whispered, "Maybe the world's learning after all." That night I couldn't sleep. I went to the workshop, turned on the light, and stared at the empty wood surface. For months, I'd built furniture for other people's homes. But now I wanted to build something for her, a gift that meant more than words could manage. I began sketching. A rocking chair. Solid oak. No carvings, no ornaments. Just strength, comfort, and time. A chair that could hold a tired body and a healed heart at once. The workshop always sounded different at night. The hum of the city softened, and all that remained was the quiet rhythm of the blade against wood, a heartbeat in motion. I worked until the air grew heavy with sawdust and memory. The rocking chair began to take shape under my hands, curved lines, balanced joints, a seat wide enough to hold reflection comfortably. Each stroke of sandpaper felt like a prayer, not for perfection but for understanding. This wasn't a gift for celebration. It was a reminder. Something that said, "You've learned to sit with your past now. Stay a while." By dawn the chair stood complete. Smooth, solid, honest. I brushed off the dust, ran my hand along the grain and smiled. For the first time in years I wasn't building something for approval. I was building a piece. Later that day, I loaded it into my truck and drove to the clinic. She was already there, checking patient charts with her hair pulled back and a pencil behind her ear. I set the chair down just inside the entrance. "What's this?" she asked, eyes lighting up. "Something to rest in when you forget that you've done enough," I said. She sat, leaned back, and let out a long sigh, the kind that carries months of exhaustion and grace. "This feels like home," she whispered. "It's supposed to," I said. For a few moments we just existed in the quiet hum of the clinic, no past, no apologies left, just a father and daughter who had survived pride and found something gentler on the other side. Then she looked up. "Dad, I'm proud of you." Those were words I'd spent my life trying not to need. But when she said them, they reached someplace even deeper than forgiveness. That night rain came. The city blurred behind streaks of water, and thunder rolled like an old man clearing his throat. I stayed up late, listening to it, letting the sound remind me that peace doesn't mean stillness, it means learning to stay calm in motion. I must have dozed off at the table, because the next thing I remember was the phone vibrating in my hand. It was after midnight. "Dad," her voice cracked. "There's been an accident." My heart clenched. "Where are you?" "The clinic. There was a fire. Electrical. Everyone's out, but..." "Dad, we lost most of the equipment. It's gone." I was already out the door. When I arrived, the street was a mosaic of flashing lights and smoke. Firefighters moved through the haze, voices muffled by exhaustion. The clinic windows were blackened, glass cracked, the sign above the door sagging in defeat. My daughter stood near the curb, wrapped in a blanket. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. She just stared at the building, the dream she'd built, the one that had given her purpose, now folded in ash and water. "I'm so sorry," when she saw me. "I don't know how to start again." I put my arm around her. "You already have." She shook her head. "I lost everything." "No," I said. "You lost walls. You didn't lose your purpose." She buried her face against my chest, and I felt her body tremble. There are no words for that kind of grief, the one that comes not from failure but from unfairness. So I said the only thing that mattered. "We'll rebuild. Together." The next few weeks were a blur of cleanup and kindness. Volunteers showed up from nowhere, neighbors, former patients, strangers who'd read her story and wanted to help. They brought tools, food, money, prayers. The same world that once mocked us now moved like a tide of redemption. And in the middle of it all stood my daughter, sleeves rolled up, soot still under her nails, smiling like a woman who decided not to surrender. One afternoon, I caught her standing by the wreckage of what used to be her office. She turned to me, eyes bright through the dust. "I get it now," she said. "Get what?" "What you meant by arithmetic. You give love, the world takes some, and then you give again. Eventually it balances." I smiled. "And what about the debt?" She looked at the half-burned doorway, then at me. "Paid in full," she said. A month later the clinic reopened, smaller, humbler but alive. The new sign read Kohl Family Health Center, and I couldn't speak for a full minute after seeing it. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "Yes, I did," she replied. "It's the foundation beneath it all." The rocking chair had survived the fire. Somehow miraculously it had been stored in the back office untouched. They placed it in the waiting area near the window where the light fell just right. She told me the patients called it the father's chair. No one was allowed to sit there for long, only those who needed rest or courage, or a moment to remember that love, even when broken, can. Every time I visit, I run my hand along the armrest, feeling the faint grooves of the wood, the proof of effort, the language of endurance. The fire could burn walls. It couldn't touch what we built inside ourselves. Because real peace isn't found in safety. It's found in survival, quiet, unglamorous human survival. The kind that holds its ground not through strength, but through staying. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and looked around. The folder of invoices was gone. The letters, the news clippings, the noise, all boxed away. On the wall above my table hung only two things now: the plaque she made me and a photograph of the clinic's new sign. And as rain whispered against the window, I realized something I hadn't before. The story was no longer about loss or redemption. It was about continuation. The kind that doesn't end when the credits roll, because it's still being written in the quiet hours of ordinary days. I used to think peace meant the absence of noise. But real peace, I've learned, has a sound. It's the slow creak of a rocking chair on a quiet morning. It's the faint laughter of a nurse greeting a child in a hallway that nearly burned down. It's the steady breath of someone who finally stopped defending the truth, because it no longer needs defending. A few months had passed since the fire. The clinic was whole again, though not perfect. The paint was new, the floors uneven, the ceiling patched in places that still carried the scent of smoke. But I found beauty in those imperfections, proof that even broken things can survive their own endings. I visited often, sometimes to help with repairs, sometimes just to sit in that chair by the window. Patients would nod politely, as if they sensed I was part of the story, though none of them ever asked which part. That's the thing about healing spaces. They don't demand your history, only your presence. One morning, while fixing a loose railing, I noticed a small brass plaque on the wall that hadn't been there before. It read, "In memory of the lessons that cost the most, and the love that paid for them." I ran my fingers over the words, tracing them the way you trace a scar, not to mourn it but to confirm it's real. When my daughter walked in, I nodded toward the plaque. She smiled. "It's for both of us." "Feels like it's for everyone," I said. "Maybe it is," she replied. "We all learned the expensive way." We went for lunch that day, something we hadn't done in years. A small diner near the river, the kind that still used glass sugar jars and called everyone Han. She told me about her patients, her plans, the upcoming community fundraiser. Her voice carried a calm I hadn't heard since she was a child. She didn't rush her words anymore. She didn't measure them for approval. At one point she paused and said, "You know, I never thanked you properly." "For what?" "For staying. When I gave you every reason not to." I stirred my coffee. "That's what love is, kid. It stays. Not because it's easy, but because it remembers." She smiled. "You still call me kid." "Always will," I said. After lunch we walked along the riverbank. The water moved slowly, thick with sunlight and quiet stories. She stopped near the railing and leaned on it, eyes on the horizon. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "The wedding," I said. "No. Regret's a tax you pay on something you already own." She looked at me confused. I smiled. "It means I've made peace with the cost." She nodded slowly, letting that sink in. Then she said something that stayed with me for days after. "I think forgiveness is just another form of inheritance. You don't know what to do with it at first, but one day you realize it's the only thing worth keeping." I didn't answer right away. I was too busy memorizing that sentence the way a craftsman memorizes a perfect measurement. Later that evening, I returned home to my quiet apartment. The same walls, different now. Not newer, just lighter. I sat at the table and opened a small envelope that had been delivered earlier. Inside was a photo, the new clinic, all the staff lined up out front. My daughter in the center holding a small sign that said, "We're still here." On the back she'd written, "Because you taught me that love doesn't end when it's ignored, only when it's forgotten." I set the photo on the table, next to the old plaque and the folded invoices I never threw away. Together they told the whole story: pride, pain, debt, redemption, the arithmetic of love written in human handwriting. And in that quiet moment, I realized something I'd never said out loud before. The $500,000 never bought anything, but it built everything. Time has a strange rhythm when you start paying attention to it. It doesn't move in hours or days anymore, it moves in realizations. And the older you get, the quieter those realizations arrive. For months I kept returning to the same thought. Maybe all of this, the humiliation, the invoice, the fire, the rebuilding, wasn't a punishment. Maybe it was a lesson in how love teaches you through loss what gratitude never could through comfort. That's the thing about grace. It doesn't erase your scars. It just teaches you to stop tracing them with regret. One evening I closed the workshop early. The sky outside was still faintly gold, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's remembering something beautiful. I brewed a cup of tea, I've grown too old for coffee this late, and sat by the window. The city hummed below. It didn't care about my story anymore. And that was the most peaceful part of all. In the distance I could see the faint rooftop of the clinic, its lights still on. I knew she was probably there, finishing paperwork or talking to one last patient who couldn't afford to be sick tomorrow. She'd become the kind of woman her mother would have been proud of, the kind who loves not to impress but to repair. And that thought alone filled me with a quiet joy that felt bigger than any apology ever could. Sometimes I still think about that day, the wedding, the vineyard, the way the world tilted when my own daughter pretended not to know me. It doesn't sting anymore. Doesn't even ache. It just lives there like an old bruise that turned into memory. If I close my eyes, I can still smell the air, wine and grass and something artificial that called itself perfection. I can see her glowing, terrified of being small in a world that only celebrates the large. And I can see myself standing behind the crowd, silent, still proud, even when pride was the problem. I didn't know it then, but that day wasn't my undoing. It was my beginning. Because love, I've learned, doesn't disappear when it's uninvited. It just waits quietly until the truth remembers its name. One afternoon, months later, I received an invitation. Simple envelope. No gold trim. No designer lettering. Just her handwriting. It said, "We're celebrating the first anniversary of the clinic. Please come. There's a chair with your name on it." I smiled. She'd meant it literally. When I arrived, the place was alive with music and laughter. The waiting room had been transformed with strings of lights, food trays, and framed photos of families who'd been helped that year. She gave a short speech, humble, clear, radiant. Then she gestured toward me. "My father taught me that the things we build outlast the things we buy," she said. "This place and everything it stands for was built from his lessons. Not his money. His heart." Everyone turned to clap. I nodded, trying to keep my composure, but my throat tightened anyway. When the noise quieted, she brought over a small envelope. Inside was a certificate, the clinic's new foundation fund, named the Benjamin Kohl Scholarship for Compassionate Medicine. I looked up and for a second the world blurred. Not from pride, from gratitude that had nowhere left to go. Later, after the crowd thinned, she sat beside me in Father's chair. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. We just sat there, letting the room breathe around us, the light falling soft and forgiving. And I thought, maybe this is what legacy really means. Not a name carved in marble. Not a fortune passed down in numbers. But the quiet relief of knowing that someone, somewhere will live easier because you stayed when it was hardest. That night when I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. The city glowed faintly through the curtains, enough to see by. I walked to my workbench, brushed the dust from the old plaque and read it again. In honor of Benjamin Kohl, the foundation beneath it all. I smiled. For years I thought the foundation I built was for her. Now I understood she was the foundation for me. She'd rebuilt my faith in people, in forgiveness, in the idea that no story is too broken to end beautifully. Before going to bed, I wrote one last note. Not for her, not for the world. Just for me. I tucked it inside the folder where the invoices used to live. I gave her money once, thinking it would make her future stronger. But it wasn't the money that changed her. It was the loss. And it wasn't the loss that taught me. It was the love that refused to leave, even when uninvited. That's the real inheritance, to stay, to forgive, to keep building. I sealed it shut, slid the folder away and turned off the light. For the first time in years, sleep came easy. Because I finally understood that every painful thing that had ever happened, every wound, every silence, every lesson had been worth the cost. The bill had been high, but love finally was paid in full. The older I get, the less I believe in endings. Things don't really end, they just change shape. Love becomes memory. Pain becomes wisdom. And sometimes the people who once broke your heart become the very reason it beats steady again. It had been nearly 2 years since that night in the vineyard. The night I became invisible on my daughter's most visible day. Now my life got fuller in the ways that count. Mornings began with sunlight spilling through the blinds instead of alarm clocks. I'd brew my tea, open the window and listen to the city wake. Somewhere down the street, a bakery started its ovens at the same time every day. That smell, butter and sugar and the faint promise of something new, had become the hymn of my mornings. The workshop still hummed. Old wood, new projects. Repairs for neighbors who paid in gratitude and stories instead of money. I never turned anyone away. Not because I didn't need the cash, but because I understood something now. Fixing things was my language. And some people just needed a sentence of kindness to keep their day from collapsing. One afternoon, a young man came by holding a broken chair leg. He looked barely 20, nervous, uncertain of the world. "Sir," he said, "you built the chair in the clinic, right? The one by the window." I nodded. "My mother sat there before her surgery," he said. "She said it gave her peace." He hesitated. "Can you fix ours?" I took the chair leg gently, turned it in my hands. "Sure," I said. "But only if you tell your mother I'm glad she healed." He smiled. "She already told me you'd say that." When he left, I felt something warm settle in my chest. It's strange how the smallest acts, a chair, a word, a gesture, can ripple wider than you ever meant them to. Later that week, I stopped by the clinic again. The building was alive, laughter, conversation, footsteps that carried purpose. The walls wore framed drawings from children, hearts, suns, a sketch of my daughter standing with a stethoscope, stick figures smiling around her. She saw me and waved me over. "I was just telling a patient about you," she said. "Good things, I hope." She grinned. "The best kind. The kind that make people believe second chances are real." I looked around the room, at the lives being stitched back together, at the comfort around like shared air. And I realized, this wasn't just her redemption. It was mine too. After work, she drove us to the old vineyard. It had been sold and renamed, turned into a public park. The same hill, the same trees, the same wind, only this time no designer tents, no orchestras, no guests pretending to smile for photographs. We walked the path slowly, until we reached the spot where it had all happened. She stopped, turned to me and said softly, "This is where I forgot who I was." "And where you remembered," I said. She took a deep breath, then smiled. Can I show you something? From her bag she pulled a small jar, inside a handful of ashen soil. From the clinic fire, she said. I kept some. I thought I'd bring it here. I nodded. To bury it? No, she said. To plant something in it. She poured the soil at the base of an old oak, pressed her hand into the ground, and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then she stood and said, everything that burned helped me see what couldn't. I looked at her, really looked, and saw not the girl I raised, not the woman who lost her way, but the soul who found her purpose the hard way and refused to quit. You did good, kid, I said. She smiled through tears. You always say that. Because it's always true. We stayed there until the sky went amber. The wind softened, carrying the scent of old wine and new beginnings. And for the first time that vineyard, the place that once held my humiliation, felt holy. Not because it had changed, but because I had. On the drive home she rested her head against the window, half asleep, the kind of tired that comes from peace, not worry. I glanced at her reflection in the glass and thought of all the years between then and now. Every silence, every wound, every word we'd left unsaid that somehow found its way back in different forms. Life, I realized, had given me more than I'd lost. And sometimes that's all redemption really is, not getting back what was taken but finally understanding why it had to go in the first place. That night before bed I stood by my window again. Below me the city pulsed with lights, with life, with forgiveness disguised as another day. And in that soft hum I heard it, the sound of things continuing. Because love, when it's real, doesn't end with I forgive you. It ends with I'm still here. And we were. Still here. Still whole. Still home. It's strange how life keeps moving after you think your story's been told. You spend years thinking the lesson was for you, only to wake one morning and realize it was for everyone else. The story had faded from headlines long ago, but somehow it kept finding its way into quiet corners. People would send letters to the clinic, handwritten, folded neatly, full of gratitude and confession. Some were from daughters, some from fathers, some from strangers who said things like, "Your story made me call home." I read a few of them one afternoon while helping my daughter file papers. One in particular stayed with me. "Mr. Kohl, I don't know you, but your story stopped me from walking away from my own father's wedding. He's not perfect, but he's trying. Thank you for reminding me that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's return." I sat with that letter for a long time. All those years I thought my silence had been wasted. All those nights I thought dignity went unseen. And yet here it was, proof that the quiet things we do still echo, long after we stop speaking. A few months later, a local university invited me to speak. Not to teach woodworking, not to talk about money, but about integrity. I laughed when I read the email. Integrity, they said. Like it was a subject you could put on a chalkboard. But my daughter convinced me. "Go," she said. "You've spent your whole life showing what dignity looks like. Maybe it's time you say it out loud." So I went. It was a small auditorium. Students, professors, a few faces from the neighborhood. I stood at the podium in my usual clothes. Clean jeans, rolled up sleeves, nothing fancy. I didn't bring notes. I didn't need any. I began simply. I'm not a rich man. Not in the way this world usually defines it. But I've learned that what we value says more about us than what we own. I once sent my daughter a bill, $500,000, not to collect debt, but to remind both of us what love had already paid for. The room went still. You could feel the air holding its breath. I thought I'd lost her that day, I continued. But sometimes love needs to break before it can become honest again. And sometimes forgiveness doesn't show up with flowers. It shows up in silence, in patience, in the courage to stay. I looked around, rows of young faces, eyes wide, phones forgotten. Don't let pride convince you that dignity means distance, I said. Dignity just means truth without noise. And truth, well, truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. When I finished, no one clapped at first. They just sat there, quiet, thoughtful. Then someone stood. Then another. The applause came slow, but it wasn't for me. It was for the sound of honesty in a room that hadn't heard enough of it. Afterward, a student approached me. She couldn't have been more than 20. Nervous smile, hands shaking as she held out a notebook. "Can you sign this?" she asked. "Sign it." I laughed. "I'm not famous." She smiled. "You are to my dad." It hit me like a small miracle, the way stories travel. Not on screens. Not through fame. Through hearts that recognize themselves in yours. That night when I got home, my daughter called. I heard how it went, she said. You made half the room cry. Only half. I joked. She laughed, that same laugh from when she was little. Dad, she said softly, you know the clinic got another donation today? Anonymous. The note said, for the man who sent the... I smiled. Maybe it's Trent. Maybe, she said. Or maybe it's someone who just finally understood. Before bed, I walked to my window one last time. The city lights blinked like distant memories, familiar, kind, unjudging. I thought about everything the world had taken, and everything it had given back in quieter forms. Regret had turned into reflection. Pride had softened into peace. And the story that began with a bill ended with a lesson too big to fit on paper. Love doesn't keep score. It just keeps showing up, quieter each time, stronger each time, until it no longer needs words at all. I turned off the light, sat in my old rocking chair, and let the night breathe around me. In the dark, I whispered the only prayer I've ever known by heart. Thank you for the lesson, Lord, and for letting me live long enough to learn it. Time has a way of humbling even the proudest hearts. Not with punishment but with patience. It waits long enough for you to see the circle, long enough for the echoes of your choices to come back home. For me, that circle began to close on a quiet spring morning. The clinic was thriving, my daughter was busier than ever, and I had settled into a peace I once thought was impossible. But age, that unspoken accountant, had started keeping its own ledgers. The hands that once lifted lumber now trembled when I held a cup. The back that had carried beams and burdens alike began to complain after an hour at the workbench. And the mirror, patient and cruel, showed a man weathered not by failure, but by living. I didn't fight it. If anything, I welcomed it. Aging, I realized, was proof that the story had lasted long enough to matter. That week, I went in for my regular checkup at the clinic. She insisted, she always did. When she walked in, clipboard in hand, she tried to look professional, but I saw the smile hiding behind her doctor's mask. Blood pressure's high again, she said, pretending to scold me. Probably because my doctor's bossy, I replied. She laughed, shaking her head. You know, we've had this conversation about diet 100 times. And yet here I am, I said. Still stubborn, still alive. She rolled her eyes, jotting notes, then said, You're due for a real break. No more sawdust for a week. Then who's going to fix your leaky window? I asked. Her expression softened. You're supposed to be resting, not rescuing. Same thing to me, I said. She sighed, smiling despite herself. You never stop being a father, do you? No, I said. And I hope I never do. After the appointment, I stayed behind a little longer. The waiting area was empty, sunlight stretching across the floor, catching the grain of that old rocking chair I'd built. I sat in it slowly now, and let the chair creak beneath my weight. I thought about the years that had carried us here, the broken vows, the burning bridges, the rebuilding, the forgiveness that arrived like sunrise instead of thunder. And I realized something quietly profound. I'd spent so long trying to teach her what dignity meant. But she'd spent the last few years teaching me what grace actually feels like. Grace is softer than forgiveness. It doesn't need apologies or explanations. It just says, You're still here, that's enough. As the day faded, she joined me by the window. Her hair had a few strands of silver now, just enough to catch the light. Long day? I asked. She nodded. We had a patient today. A girl 19. Pregnant, scared, no family. She said she didn't know if she could keep the baby. I waited, knowing what came next. I told her, she said, about you. About what happens when we mistake love for shame. And I think she's going to keep it. I smiled. That's how it works. The truth keeps moving, even when we stop. She leaned against my shoulder, and for a long moment, we just watched the light fade through the window. Dad, she quietly. Yeah. Thank you. For staying alive long enough for me to say thank you. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I just reached over and held her hand, the same hand that once clung to mine at every first day of school, every fever, every heartbreak. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That night, I walked home slower than usual. Not because I was tired, because I wanted to memorize everything. The hum of traffic, the scent of rain-soaked earth, the faint laughter of strangers whose lives I'd never know. It all felt connected somehow, part of the same great arithmetic that had balanced my own. I stopped halfway down the block and looked up. The sky was the color of forgiveness, soft, endless, familiar. And I said to no one in particular, "We did it, kid." When I got home, I sat at my table, opened my old journal and began to write. Not for publication, not for legacy, just for truth. If anyone ever finds this, know this much. Pride is heavy. Love is light. And the people who hurt you aren't always your enemies. Sometimes they're just mirrors, showing you the parts of yourself that still need healing. Don't run from it. Don't bury it. Let it teach you. Then let it go. I closed the notebook, set it beside the plaque, and exhaled. The circle had finally closed. There's a certain calm that comes when you've said everything you needed to say in this life. It doesn't announce itself. It just arrives one morning like a quiet guest, sits across from you, and waits for you to notice it. That calm found me one spring evening. The air was gentle, the kind that feels like forgiveness in motion. The city was soft, almost slow, like it was catching its breath after a long apology. I sat in my workshop, surrounded by the faint smell of pine and varnish, the ghosts of old projects watching quietly from the corners. The rocking chair was still there, steady as ever, holding the imprint of 1,000 reflections. I wasn't sick. Not in the dramatic way stories often demand. But the body has its own way of whispering truths before the mind catches on. The fatigue lingered longer. The heart skipped a beat more often. The world felt both sharper and softer at once. That night I picked up my journal again. Not out of habit, out of instinct. It felt like the right time to finish the story I didn't realize I'd been writing all along. To my daughter. If you're reading this, it means time finally caught up with me, as it does with all of us. Don't be sad. I got to see the ending of our story, and it was beautiful. I once thought my worth could be measured in what I built, in what I gave, in what I could fix. But I was wrong. My real legacy wasn't in the workbench or the wood. It was in you, in the woman who learned that grace is louder than shame and that truth is stronger than pride. You've done what I could not. You've made peace into a language other people can understand. Promise me one thing. Keep building, not just clinics or chairs or homes. Build people. Build kindness. Build the kind of love that doesn't need forgiveness because it never learned how to leave. And when you sit in that chair by the window, don't think of me as gone. Think of me as resting beside you, still proud, still patient, still here. I closed the notebook and placed it inside the top drawer, just beneath the plaque she'd carved. I didn't feel fear, only gratitude. Gratitude for the long road that had taken everything, then given it all back in better form. A week later, she stopped by with groceries. She scolded me for not eating enough, then stayed to make soup. We talked about the clinic, about her plans, about how she'd started mentoring younger doctors, how she was teaching them that medicine isn't just science, it's sanctuary. At one point, she looked up and said, "You ever think about what comes next?" I smiled. I used to, but not anymore. She frowned gently. That sounds final. It's not, I said. It's faith. She nodded, not pressing further. We ate in silence after that, the kind that doesn't feel heavy, only full. When she left, she hugged me tighter than usual. Love you, Dad. Love you more, kid. That night, the city fell quiet early. I sat by the window, my tea cooling beside me, the clock ticking steady like a patient heart. The lights outside flickered, like stars pretending to live closer to Earth, and I thought about everything that had brought me here. The $500,000 bill, the pride, the silence, the forgiveness that had taken its time finding its way home. Funny thing about redemption, it never arrives when you're looking for it. It comes when you stop fighting the parts of yourself that deserved love all along. Sometime before dawn, I must have dozed off in the chair. The world outside was still dark but soft, the first edge of morning pressing against the horizon. I dreamed of the vineyard, not the one filled with guests and champagne, but the empty one years later, quiet, golden, at peace. My daughter stood under the same tree, sunlight brushing her shoulders, that same calm in her eyes. She was planting something, not flowers this time. A small oak sapling, its roots trembling in the soil. She turned toward me, smiling, and said, "See, Dad? Everything grows again." I smiled back, and in that light, it didn't matter if it was dream or memory, it felt like truth. When she came by the next morning, the tea was still on the table. Half full, still warm. The window open. The city humming softly, as if keeping vigil. She found me in the chair, peaceful, head tilted slightly toward the light. And she didn't cry right away. She just stood there, smiling through tears that hadn't formed yet, whispering, "You kept your promise. You stayed." And in that quiet room, I like to think she felt it. That love doesn't die. It just changes form. Maybe it becomes sunlight through a window. Maybe it becomes the whisper of a chair rockly. Or maybe it becomes the gentle courage in a daughter's voice when she tells the next soul who's ready to give up. It gets better, I promise. Grief doesn't announce itself. It just moves in quietly, rearranges the furniture of your heart, and waits for you to notice what's missing. When my father passed, the world didn't stop. The city still hummed, the bakery still opened at dawn, and the same light that once touched his workshop now fell across empty tools. But everything sounded different, thinner somehow, as though silence had learned how to breathe. The morning I found him, I thought he was asleep. The tea was still on the table, a small steam cloud frozen mid-rise. His journal lay open to the last page, his handwriting steady, unfaltering. I didn't cry at first. Grief has manners. It waits for you to read the note before it enters the room. If love has any final lesson, it's this: it never ends. It only continues through whoever remembers it kindly. If you're reading this, keep going. The world still needs more gentle people. That line, "more gentle people," has lived in me ever since. We buried him near the river. Not in a grand cemetery, not in a family plot. He would have hated the fuss. Just a quiet patch of earth beneath a willow tree, where the wind sounded like a whisper you could almost understand. I placed the small plaque from his workshop on the headstone. The foundation beneath it all. The day of the funeral was cloudy but kind. The people who came weren't the ones who knew his name from headlines. They were carpenters, patients, neighbors, nurses, the quiet ones. The ones he'd fixed something for, listened to, or simply reminded to keep going. One by one, they placed something beside his grave. A letter, a small piece of wood, a flower carved by hand. It wasn't mourning. It was gratitude. The clinic closed for a week. When we reopened, there was a different kind of calm in the air, as if everyone who walked through the doors could feel that something steady was watching over them. We renamed the waiting area the Kohl room. The rocking chair stayed exactly where it had always been, beside the window. I had the staff polish it but never refinish it. The small scratches, the wear along the armrests, those were his fingerprints. Sometimes patients would sit there and ask, "Who was he?" And I'd smile and say, "Someone who taught me that love doesn't always sound like 'I love you.' Sometimes it sounds like, 'Take your time. I'll be here.'" Weeks turned to months. The grief didn't fade, it just changed weight. Some days it felt like a feather, others like a beam. But always it was there, proof that love had existed in a form too large to disappear. One afternoon, a man came in for a checkup. Early 40s, nervous, clearly out of place. When I introduced myself, he said, "You're Benjamin Kohl's daughter, right?" I nodded, surprised. "I was one of your father's students," he said, "at the university talk. He told us something that's been stuck in my head for years. Dignity is truth without noise. I never forgot it. I teach now, and I tell my students the same thing." He smiled. "Just thought you should know he's still teaching." That was the first time I cried in months, not because I missed him more, but because I realized I never really lost him at all. Later that week, I went back to the vineyard. The oak tree we planted had already grown taller, its roots deep and unapologetic. I sat beneath it with his old journal, flipping through pages that still smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Halfway through, I found something I hadn't noticed before, a small envelope tucked between two pages. My name written in his careful script. I opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a few words, simple and certain. "When I go, don't build me a statue. Build someone's hope." I laughed through the tears. Still giving orders, huh? The wind rustled the leaves like it was agreeing. So that's what I did. The following month, we launched a new program at the clinic, the Benjamin Fund. It paid for medical care for families who couldn't afford it, covered schooling for kids who wanted to study medicine, and offered free therapy sessions for anyone carrying invisible wounds. I didn't need to advertise it. People just found it. And every time someone asked who it was named after, I'd say, "A man who built things that outlived him." At night, after closing, I'd sit in his chair by the window and write letters I'd never send. Sometimes I'd tell him about my day. Sometimes I'd ask for advice I already knew the answer to. Sometimes I'd just sit there, listening to the sound of the city that once broke him, now quietly humming his name. I don't know where love goes when it leaves the body, but I know where it stays. In the hands that keep building. In the words that keep teaching. In the hearts that refuse to stop forgiving. And that's where he lives now, not gone, just changed. It's been 3 years since my father's passing, and yet there are mornings when I still reach for my phone before remembering he won't pick up. Then I smile, because somewhere in that silence I can still hear him. "Take your time, kid," he would say. "The world waits for the ones who move with meaning." And so I do. The clinic grew. What started as a small community practice became something larger, a foundation, a network of care across cities, each built on the same idea he lived by: help quietly, love loudly. People began calling it the Kohl way. But to me, it was just my father's handwriting written into the walls of every room. I speak at medical schools now, just as he once did at that university lecture. Students ask about him like he's a myth, and I always tell them the truth. He wasn't extraordinary. He was consistent. He didn't raise his voice, he raised his standards. And when the world tried to humiliate him, he answered with grace that echoed louder than any revenge. They always go quiet at that part. That's when I see it, the recognition. That small, beautiful pause when someone realizes that strength doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears patience. One day after a talk, a young woman approached me. She couldn't have been older than 21. Eyes sharp, shoulders tense, the look of someone carrying something heavy. "Your father," she said, "he's the one who sent that letter to his daughter, right? The one who charged her for her wedding." I nodded carefully. She hesitated. "My dad stopped talking to me a year ago. I thought about writing him last night, then I found a clip of your father's story online. And I did." Her voice cracked. "He wrote back this morning." I reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. Then the story did its job. She smiled, wiping a tear. "He said the same thing." When I drove home that evening, the sun was setting low. A soft, amber light spilling over the city like forgiveness in motion. At a stoplight, I caught a glimpse of the old workshop. It's still there. I've kept it just as he left it. Tools lined neatly, sawdust resting where it wants, his old rocking chair by the window. Sometimes I go there after dark, not to work, but to remember. The walls still hum when it rains. The smell of cedar still clings to the air. And if I close my eyes long enough, I can almost hear him humming, that low tune he used to whistle when he was content. That's how I know he's still here. Every year on the anniversary of his passing, I visit the vineyard. The oak we planted has grown strong. Its roots deep. Its branches heavy with leaves that catch the morning light like they're holding onto something sacred. I bring his journal with me. I read one page out loud, a different one each year, and bury a folded copy in the soil beneath the tree. Not to let go. To keep growing. Because that's what he did. He built things that outlasted apology, that turned pain into structure, that made love something you could sit on in and believe again. The last time I went, I brought someone with me, a little girl with his eyes. My daughter. His granddaughter. She's only 5 but already curious, always asking about Grandpa Ben. I told her stories about the workshop, about the rocking chair, about how he once sent a bill not to get paid, but to remind the world that love too has value. She looked up at me with that same spark he used to get when he'd finished a perfect cut of wood and said, "Grandpa sounds like a good man." I smiled. He was the best kind, the kind who stayed. That evening back at home, I found one of his old letters tucked between 2 books on a shelf I hadn't touched in years. In his handwriting, faint but firm, it read, "If I'm remembered for anything, let it not be the bill I sent, but the silence that followed, the moment when I chose patience over pride. That's where love truly begins." I closed the letter, pressed it against my heart, and whispered, "You're still teaching, Dad." And I swear, for a heartbeat the room felt warmer. There's an old chair by a clinic window, steady, simple, carved by hand. Every day someone new sits in it. A tired mother. A scared child. A man trying to forgive himself. They rest, breathe, and look out at the world. They don't know whose hands shaped that wood, whose love lives in its grain. But somehow they feel it. Because grace once built never fades. It lives quietly, in chairs, in hearts, in stories. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the wood creak softly and a voice whisper, "Take your time, kid. I'm still here."